My name is James, though almost no one calls me that anymore. At work I'm Jim, efficient and agreeable, a person whose edges have been rounded by years of learning how to fit. To my family, I'm still kiddo in a way that has less to do with age and more to do with habit. I am 34 years old, outwardly settled, inwardly restless, and at the start of this memory I believed, sincerely, that I understood myself well enough to stop asking difficult questions. My Aunt Maria has always been the exception in my life, the person who noticed the questions even when I didn't ask them out loud. She is my mother's older sister, childless by circumstance rather than choice, and she lives alone in a weathered house near the coast where everything smells faintly of salt and eucalyptus. She is the kind of woman who listens without leaning forward, who offers help without making it feel like rescue. When I told her I needed a break and asked if I could stay for a week, she said yes the way some people say breathe. The trip was meant to be uneventful. I packed lightly but deliberately, choosing clothes that felt neutral, professional, safe. At the airport, I moved through security with practiced ease, the rhythm of travel calming me. I didn't yet know that this sense of order was temporary, or that its collapse would be quiet rather than dramatic. The problem announced itself at baggage claim, in the dull clatter of the carousel that kept turning without offering anything that belonged to me. I waited longer than made sense, watching strangers reclaim their things and disappear. When I finally spoke to the airline agent, she typed, frowned sympathetically, and delivered the verdict with rehearsed softness. My bag had been sent elsewhere. They would locate it, she assured me. It would arrive soon. I nodded and thanked her, because that's what I do when circumstances disappoint me. Only later, standing alone with my backpack and my phone buzzing with Maria's "Where are you?" text, did the weight of it register. All my clothes, my careful presentation of self, were gone. I was reduced to what I had worn on the plane, and whatever improvisation lay ahead. Maria greeted me at the curb with a hug that smelled like laundry detergent and familiarity. I told her about the luggage as we drove, minimizing it out of habit. She listened, eyes on the road, and said only, "We'll manage." That plural mattered more than I realized at the time. Her house hadn't changed. The same mismatched mugs, the same creak in the hallway floorboard. She put the kettle on and let me talk until my voice steadied. I noticed then how tired I was, not just from travel, but from carrying a version of myself that required constant upkeep. It was evening when the practical implications surfaced. I stood in the guest room, staring at the single change of clothes I had, doing mental math about days and laundry cycles. Maria appeared in the doorway with an armful of folded garments. She didn't preface it with apology or explanation.
"These are mine," she said.
"They might help until your bag shows up." I looked at what she was holding and felt my reflexes engage before my thoughts caught up. A skirt, a soft sweater, comfortable clothes chosen for ease rather than display. My mouth opened to refuse, because refusal was familiar ground. There were rules, unspoken, internalized, that told me this was crossing a line I wasn't meant to approach. "I can't wear those," I said, too quickly. Maria raised an eyebrow, not challengingly, just inquisitive. "Why not?" The question landed harder than I expected. I had answers ready, about appearances, about propriety, but they felt thin the moment I tried to assemble them. The truth, or something close to it, hovered just out of reach, that the resistance wasn't about her clothes, but about what wearing them might reveal to me. "I don't want to make things awkward," I said instead. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of the mouth. "Awkwardness usually comes from pretending," she said, "not from practicality." She left the clothes on the bed and gave me privacy, without ceremony. Alone, I sat down and stared at the fabric as if it might accuse me of something. I was aware of my heart rate, of the way my thoughts kept circling back to the same question. What was I actually afraid of? When I changed, it was without drama. The sensations were subtle but undeniable. The way the clothes altered how I stood, how I occupied space. It wasn't excitement or shame that followed, but a heightened awareness, as if a dimmer switch inside me had been turned up slightly. Looking in the mirror, I saw myself reframed, not transformed into someone else, but revealed from a different angle. I stepped back into the kitchen braced for commentary. None came. Maria glanced at me, nodded once, and returned to stirring a pot on the stove. That ordinary response unsettled me more than judgment would have. It suggested that this moment, which felt monumental to me, could exist without spectacle. Over dinner we talked about small things. I listened more than usual, aware of my own presence in a way I hadn't been before. Later, lying in bed, I replayed the day not with panic, but with a careful curiosity. Something had shifted, not externally, not in any way that demanded announcement, but internally, in how honestly I was willing to observe myself. The lost luggage would arrive eventually. That was a solvable problem. What it had interrupted, however, was a certainty I'd relied on without examining. In its place was a question I could no longer ignore. If a small, practical choice could feel this significant, what else had I been avoiding simply because it didn't fit the story I told about who I was? I fell asleep knowing that whatever came next would ask something of me. Not theatrics, not declarations, but attention and responsibility. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure I wanted to look away. The morning light came filtered through the curtains, pale and hesitant, as if unsure whether the world outside was ready for me. I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks and stains that had always been there, unnoticed until now. I wasn't anxious, exactly, but alert, like a person walking through a familiar street and suddenly noticing every shadow, every whisper of movement. Maria was already in the kitchen. I could hear her moving quietly, the clink of a mug against the counter, the faint hiss of boiling water. I dressed quickly, the borrowed skirt and sweater still fitting comfortably, and for the first time, I realized the extent to which my own reflection had changed. It wasn't just the fabric, it was how I carried myself. My posture felt slightly lighter, my gestures smaller, more contained, yet at the same time more deliberate. Every step I took in the hallway felt like a negotiation between old habits and something new, something unclaimed. Maria was waiting at the table with breakfast arranged in the unassuming way she always did, a plate of toast, fruit, and tea. She looked up and smiled, as though acknowledging that I had survived the night with some unspoken trial intact. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice had that soft insistence, the kind that lets you refuse but makes refusal feel unnecessary. I nodded. Sitting across from her, I was struck by the quiet intimacy of the moment. No questions about the clothes. No judgment about how I looked. Just the small, steady rhythm of ordinary life. And yet, ordinary felt impossible. I was aware of the external world waiting beyond her door. The neighbors, the shops, the town itself, and for the first time, I felt the weight of how small my presence might seem and how easily it could be misread. After breakfast, Maria suggested a walk into town. My chest tightened. The thought of being seen, fully visible in her clothes, navigating streets I had not walked in this version of myself, made my stomach knot. I wanted to say no, to retreat into the safe enclosure of her house. And yet, something inside me, quiet but persistent, urged me to go. I don't know if I'm ready, I admitted. That's fine, Maria said, not pressing. But walking doesn't have to be a test. Sometimes it's just noticing what's there. We left the house and stepped onto the narrow streets, the salt-tinged air filling my lungs. At first, every glance from a passerby made my skin crawl. I imagined judgment in every corner, every reflection in a shop window. But slowly, as we walked, I realized that most people were absorbed in their own lives. The world did not pause for me. It did not scrutinize me. And yet, the self-consciousness did not disappear. It shifted inward. I noticed how the skirt brushed my knees, how the sweater felt warmer against my skin than my usual attire. I noticed the subtle sway of my body, the difference in how I navigated space. And I noticed something else, an unexpected ease, a kind of permission to exist differently, even if only temporarily. We stopped at a small cafe I remembered from childhood visits. Maria ordered and I followed, sitting at a table near the window. Watching her interact with the barista, so natural, so unself-conscious, I felt both admiration and envy. How easily she inhabited the world, without armor or pretense, without the burden of identity as a performance. When the barista smiled at me, politely, without lingering judgment, I realized I was learning something in the quietest way possible. Visibility, I thought, was not inherently terrifying. It was the meaning we assigned to it that weighed us down. I could be seen, and nothing catastrophic had to follow. We walked back through the town slowly. Maria spoke about the shops, the changes since my last visit, and occasionally paused to greet neighbors. I stayed quiet, mostly listening, observing, noting the fluidity of social interactions I had long avoided thinking about. In the safety of her presence, I began to notice patterns I had never considered. Small kindnesses, unspoken rules, the way people read each other without words. By the time we returned home, I felt the subtle shift of the day in my body. My chest was lighter. My movements felt less restrained. But the day had also left questions behind, questions about how much of myself I had hidden, how often I had ignored the permission to exist in ways that might feel unfamiliar but authentic. As evening approached, I sat alone for a while, staring at the ocean visible through Maria's window. The water moved without effort, unbothered by expectations or perception. I envied that, but I also realized that I could approach life in the same way, not without self-reflection but with awareness, patience, and honesty. Maria came in then, carrying a cup of tea for me. She didn't comment on my silence. She didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. She only sat across from me and waited, the simple act of presence more instructive than anything she could have said. That night, I went to bed with the awareness that something in me had shifted yet again. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediate. But it was there, a quiet seed of change planted in the soil of ordinary experience, nurtured by patience, presence, and the gentle courage to see oneself honestly. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that the world might not be as rigid as I had believed, that the self I thought fixed might have room to expand, evolve, and even surprise me. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual, as though the town itself had been waiting to observe me, waiting to see what I would do next. I woke before sunrise, lying in the guest bed and staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint pattern of cracks and shadows. The borrowed clothes from Maria were neatly folded on the chair beside me, their softness still carrying the residual warmth of the previous day. I knew I would wear them again, not out of necessity, but because they offered a strange comfort, a freedom that felt both perilous and liberating. I dressed slowly, each movement deliberate. I noticed the subtle differences in my body as I slid into the skirt and sweater. The fabric didn't just cover me. It framed me differently, made me conscious of how I occupied space. My reflection in the mirror caught me off guard. There I was, undeniably me, yet seen from an angle I had long denied. The difference was quiet but insistent. It wasn't about how I looked to the world. It was about how I felt inhabiting myself, about the permission I allowed or withheld from my own consciousness. Maria had already begun her morning routine when I descended to the kitchen. She hummed softly as she moved, the mundane tasks of making breakfast transformed somehow into a gentle choreography. There was a rhythm to her movements, a confidence in her presence, and I felt the contrast sharply. My own life often felt rushed, cluttered, and performative, whereas hers felt deliberate, alive in ways that required no approval. We walked into town after breakfast, taking a route I had avoided in previous visits. Part of me wanted to retreat, to hide in the protective cocoon of Maria's home, where no one questioned my presence or scrutinized my appearance. And yet, I knew that growth required risk, the subtle, continuous exposure of oneself to the world, the willingness to be observed, and the humility to accept that observation without collapsing into shame or defensiveness. At first, every face in the street seemed magnified. Every glance felt loaded, every smile potentially a judgment. I imagined speculation in the eyes of strangers, constructing narratives about who I was, who I had become, and what right I had to exist visibly. My chest tightened with each step, my mind racing with calculations of distance, posture, and social code. I realized, as I walked beside Maria, that this wasn't about her clothes or their social meaning. It was about the lens through which I had always viewed myself, a lens polished with years of habit and fear.
We stopped at a small cafe.
Maria ordered effortlessly, and I followed her lead, hesitating only briefly before allowing myself to sit at a table near the window. I was acutely aware of my hands resting on my lap, the subtle weight of the skirt, the way my posture shifted without conscious instruction. A barista approached, smiled politely, and took our order. I felt a surge of surprise. The interaction was simple, unremarkable, yet I felt the internal shift it provoked. I was visible, and no catastrophe followed. Sitting there, I realized that social anxiety often arises not from the world itself, but from the projections we place upon it. The assumptions I made about judgment were far louder than any actual observation. People didn't notice me as sharply as I feared. They didn't dissect my choices or weigh my authenticity. Their attention was fleeting, cursory, or simply non-existent. What mattered most, it seemed, was how I noticed myself, how I allowed my internal narrative to dominate, and how often I had used it as a shield rather than a mirror. Walking back through the town, I began to notice subtler things. The way the bakery smelled of warm bread and yeast, the clatter of a child's bicycle on uneven pavement, the soft exchange of greetings between neighbors I had never met. Maria interacted with them naturally, without ceremony, without performance. I watched her and realized that part of her comfort came from an honesty she cultivated steadily, patiently. There was no pretense, no rigid role to maintain, just presence. I began to mimic it subtly, allowing my body to move more freely, my voice to respond naturally, my gaze to wander without fear. Each small act felt revolutionary. The day stretched ahead of me like a horizon I had never dared to approach. And as we reached the edge of town, overlooking the cliffside where the waves crashed relentlessly against jagged rocks, I was struck by the metaphor it offered: constant motion, inevitability, force tempered by time. Nothing paused for judgment. The world existed regardless of my fears. Returning to Maria's house, I felt the subtle fatigue of exposure, the exhaustion that comes not from exertion, but from the intense observation of oneself. I settled into the quiet of the living room, letting the ebb of tension recede. Maria didn't question my silence. She didn't fill it with words. She sat nearby, knitting, reading, existing in a steady rhythm that was both comforting and instructive. As evening approached, I reflected on the day. I had confronted fear and learned that the world is more indifferent than hostile. I had discovered that vulnerability can exist without shame, that visibility need not be performance, and that the fabric of identity is elastic, capable of accommodating exploration without diminishing authenticity. I had not fully understood this before. I had assumed that deviation from established roles would result in spectacle, in judgment, in error. But the truth, revealed gradually and quietly, was that change is often invisible to the external world. It is most profoundly internal, and its significance is measured in awareness, not applause. That night, lying in bed, I catalogued my observations. The skirt and sweater were no longer just borrowed fabric. They were symbols of a deeper experiment, a tentative bridge between habit and honesty. I realized that my own courage, however small, was a form of moral and emotional labor. I had acted responsibly toward myself, allowing space to grow, and toward others, by choosing awareness over avoidance. And yet, the questions remained. How far could I extend this awareness? How much of myself had I denied simply to conform? How would these small, private choices ripple outward in ways I might not yet understand? The uncertainty was uncomfortable. Yes, but it was alive. It demanded engagement. It demanded honesty. And for the first time in a long while, I welcomed it. By the time sleep overtook me, I felt the first faint thrill of self-recognition, not in reflection alone, but in the deliberate act of inhabiting the world differently, of allowing myself to be seen, imperfectly, courageously, fully. The morning light came filtered through the curtains, soft and hesitant, painting pale rectangles on the floorboards. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the faint creak of Maria's house settling, the distant hum of traffic from the town, the occasional gull crying in the cold, damp air. I could hear her moving in the kitchen, humming a tune I couldn't place, the rhythmic clink of mugs and plates. The smell of brewed coffee and faint lavender from the detergent she used drifted into the room. I breathed it in, letting it anchor me, letting it remind me that I was somewhere safe, but not completely removed from consequence. I dressed in another set of Maria's clothes, a long, cotton skirt in muted blue and a soft cardigan with sleeves that fell slightly over my hands. I noticed every detail, how the skirt brushed my ankles as I walked, how the sweater's fabric felt against my skin, how my posture felt subtly different, lighter in some ways, more tentative in others. I caught myself in the mirror and studied my reflection long enough to realize something profound. I was still me, but I was me differently. I had been handed a lens I'd never used before, and for the first time in my life, I was looking through it with attention rather than judgment. Breakfast was quiet. Maria placed a plate in front of me and sat opposite, reading a small, dog-eared book. She didn't comment on my clothes, my posture, or my expression.
She didn't need to.
Her presence alone was instruction. The world could be inhabited without constant pretense, and observation need not carry judgment. I found myself drinking tea slowly, noticing the warmth, the slight bitterness, the way it grounded me in the present. After breakfast, Maria suggested we walk further than the previous day, toward the outskirts of town where a small market operated on weekends. My chest tightened at the idea. These streets were public in a way the main avenues were not. Vendors shouted their wares, children ran past carrying balloons, neighbors exchanged casual gossip. The exposure felt sharper. I hesitated, almost refusing, and Maria, without pressing, merely looked at me with quiet encouragement. "The world isn't waiting to judge you," she said. "It's too busy living." Her words should have felt comforting, but instead they weighed heavily, because they forced me to confront something I had long avoided, the gap between my internal narrative and reality. I had believed that everyone saw me as I feared, that the world would dissect every choice, every gesture. But Maria's observation suggested otherwise. The world was indifferent, yes, but my own fear had magnified its indifference into menace. We entered the market slowly, letting the rhythm of the crowd carry us. At first, I clutched my bag close, aware of every glance, of how my borrowed skirt swayed as I walked. Each step was a negotiation between my desire to vanish and the curiosity nudging me forward. A vendor selling fresh bread smiled at Maria and waved. She returned the gesture naturally, and I followed suit, nodding slightly, awkwardly. I felt my pulse quicken, not from danger, but from vulnerability. We lingered at a stall selling handmade soaps. Maria picked up a bar of lavender and smelled it, inhaling slowly. I watched her and felt an odd mixture of admiration and self-consciousness. How effortlessly she occupied the space, how comfortable she seemed in herself. And I, in contrast, was painfully aware of every movement, every posture, every imagined judgment. A woman passing by looked at me briefly and smiled politely. My stomach twisted. In that instant, I realized something essential. The discomfort was mine alone. No one else was scrutinizing me the way I did. The world observed, perhaps, but it did not carry the weight I assumed. And yet, this recognition didn't immediately alleviate my fear. It simply shifted it inward. I began to notice myself, noticing myself. By mid-morning, the novelty of visibility began to yield subtle discoveries. I observed how I navigated conversations differently, how my voice softened when speaking with Maria, how I unconsciously adjusted my gestures to match the new rhythm my body was experiencing. I noticed patterns in human interaction that I had previously overlooked, the way people's eyes followed movement without judgment, the way small courtesies lubricated social friction, the quiet signals exchanged between strangers that maintained social cohesion. We paused near a fountain, its water churning gently, the sound hypnotic. Maria reached out, touching my elbow lightly to direct me toward a bench. I obeyed without thought, feeling the warmth of her presence as a shield and guide. Sitting there, I reflected on the strangeness of my current reality. I was visible in clothes that were not mine, inhabited a body I recognized yet saw differently, and yet I was learning a form of honesty I had never allowed before. The world outside had not collapsed. I had not been punished. And in that moment, the moral lesson was unmistakable. Courage is quiet, and its rewards are often subtle, internal, transformative. Later, as we wandered toward the edge of the market, I encountered neighbors I hadn't seen in years. Their greetings were casual, effortless, but the internal panic I expected rose nonetheless. I braced myself for scrutiny, for questions, for correction. Instead, they treated me with kindness, the faintest curiosity, and then nothing more. The encounter, brief and ordinary, reverberated inside me. I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating judgment that never existed. The lessons of perception I began to understand were mostly self-imposed. By mid-afternoon, I felt the first genuine exhaustion of extended exposure. My limbs felt heavy, my mind alert in a way that was both draining and exhilarating. Maria suggested we return home, and I welcomed the retreat, not as failure, but as necessary reflection. On the walk back, I noticed how the wind off the coast pressed against my face, how the sound of gulls and crashing waves created an odd counterpoint to the social experience I had just endured. I felt simultaneously fragile and resilient, my internal world realigning with the external one in ways I hadn't anticipated. Back in the house, Maria brewed tea, and we sat quietly, each occupied in our own activity. I lingered on the couch, staring out at the ocean, trying to catalog the myriad small sensations I had accumulated over the day. The brushing of fabric against skin, the way my voice had sounded in polite conversation, the subtle shifts in posture, the weight of vulnerability, the delicate tension of social perception. Each observation felt like a small victory, a quiet moral and emotional achievement. As night fell, I realized that what I had feared, exposure, judgment, humiliation, had been far less significant than the discomfort of honest self-awareness. The day had been exhausting, yes, but it had been instructive, revealing, and quietly liberating. I understood, with clarity that felt almost shocking, that the world did not define me. My choices, my courage, and my attention to myself did. Before sleep claimed me, I sat by the window for a long while, watching the waves below, thinking of the people I had seen, the interactions I had navigated, and the subtle, persistent truth. Identity is not a rigid construct, but a spectrum of actions, perceptions, and choices. Visibility is not inherently threatening. Vulnerability is not weakness. Authenticity, I realized, is its own reward, quietly, transforming the way one inhabits space, perceives others, and recognizes oneself. That night, sleep came slowly, wrapped in the soft fabric of borrowed clothes and the quiet awareness that each day ahead would demand something new, something brave. But for the first time, I felt equipped, not with certainty, but with attentiveness, presence, and a willingness to witness myself honestly, without pretense, without fear. The morning light was sharper this time, slicing across the bedroom with a clarity that felt almost accusatory. I woke slowly, aware of the faint ache in my shoulders and legs from yesterday's long walk, but also aware of a deeper tension, a quiet, insistent sense that something was shifting inside me and that I could no longer pretend the change was temporary. I lingered in bed, staring at the ceiling, noticing the subtle interplay of shadows as the sun rose, listening to the distant murmur of waves and the occasional gull, and I realized I had been lying to myself for years. The person I had performed as efficient, unobtrusive, conforming was only part of me. The other part, quieter and more vulnerable, had been waiting for permission to speak. Maria's soft humming drew me down the stairs. She was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, moving with that effortless grace that had always made her seem untouchable, immune to the anxieties I carried around like ballast. I dressed carefully in another of her outfits, a soft, flowing skirt and a pale cardigan that made me feel both protected and exposed. There was a subtle comfort in wearing her clothes, a tactile permission to explore something I had long denied. I was conscious of the fabric brushing my skin, of the sway of the skirt, of the way I now occupied space differently. Even simple gestures felt amplified, deliberate, meaningful. Breakfast passed in quiet companionship. Maria didn't comment on my appearance, as always. She didn't need to. Her presence alone suggested that identity could be fluid, that the world could be inhabited without constant performance, and that observation need not carry judgment. I drank my tea slowly, noticing its warmth and faint bitterness, letting it anchor me in the present. For the first time, I felt the subtle distinction between existing and performing, between seeing myself honestly and pretending I was unchanged. After breakfast, Maria suggested we venture to a part of town I hadn't explored before, the older district with its narrow, cobbled streets and small, tightly packed shops. My chest tightened at the thought of exposure. These streets were public, and there would be strangers, neighbors, anyone who might notice, anyone who might ask questions. The idea of being seen in borrowed clothes, navigating space differently, left me feeling fragile and raw. I hesitated, almost retreating, and Maria, without pressing, merely offered a glance that was both encouraging and patient. "You can go slow," she said. "There's no rush." The walk began cautiously. Each step felt conscious, every glance around charged. I imagined judgment in every face, narratives forming invisibly around me. My mind raced with potential outcomes, misinterpretation, ridicule, exposure. But as we moved deeper into the district, I began noticing subtler truths. People were absorbed in their own lives. Their attention was fleeting, incidental. The imagined scrutiny, the fear I had carried for decades, was largely my own creation. Yet the internal tension didn't ease. It shifted inward. I became aware of every movement, every sound my body made, every glance my own eyes cast. Each step felt like a negotiation between the person I had been trained to be and the person I was discovering I could become. The borrowed clothes were more than fabric. They were symbols, tactile reminders of a self I had long denied, invitations to inhabit space differently, and the consequences were psychological, not social. We paused at a small fountain in the square. Water churned gently, sunlight glinting off the surface, and I felt the first real wave of vulnerability. Maria rested a hand lightly on my elbow, guiding me to a bench. I obeyed, aware of the warmth of her presence as both comfort and lesson. Sitting there, I reflected on the strangeness of my current reality. I was visible in public, inhabiting a space differently, and yet I was learning a form of honesty I had never allowed before. Courage, I realized, is quiet, internal, often unnoticed. Its rewards are subtle but profound. As we walked again, a neighbor recognized Maria and called out a greeting. She returned it naturally, effortlessly. I nodded awkwardly, feeling the sudden weight of social expectation. I had assumed that my borrowed clothes would mark me for scrutiny, that the act of visibility would be met with judgment. Instead, the neighbor smiled politely, acknowledged me briefly, and moved on. The encounter, ordinary as it was, reverberated inside me. I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating judgment that never existed, how much of my life had been consumed by fear of perception rather than engagement with reality. Later, as we wandered toward a small market tucked between narrow streets, I felt a new tension emerge. A group of teenagers passed, their laughter carrying across the square. One of them glanced in my direction, paused, and then exchanged a look with a friend. I felt my pulse quicken, my chest tighten. I wanted to shrink, to retreat into invisibility. But Maria's presence reminded me that exposure was not inherently dangerous. The danger lay in my reaction to it. I breathed slowly, allowed the moment to pass without judgment, and noticed the subtle change in myself, my ability to observe without catastrophizing, my capacity to inhabit discomfort without surrendering to fear. At the market, we stopped at a stall selling flowers. Maria selected a small bouquet of lavender. The act of holding the flowers, of observing their delicate texture and color, grounded me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt a quiet delight, a sense of possibility. And yet, the underlying tension persisted. The world remained unpredictable. Social norms and expectations still applied, but the moral lesson I had been learning about courage, observation, and self-perception was taking root. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion arrived, not from physical exertion, but from the intense observation of myself and the environment. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts dense with reflection. Maria suggested returning home, and I welcomed it, not as retreat, but as necessary space to integrate the day's lessons. On the walk back, I noticed the wind off the coast, the faint scent of salt and wetwood, the cry of distant gulls. These external sensations mirrored my internal state, both tumultuous and grounding, chaotic yet ordered, demanding attention and reflection. At home, Maria brewed tea, and we sat quietly. I lingered by the window, staring at the ocean, cataloging the sensory and emotional experiences of the day. The sway of the skirt, the soft brush of fabric against skin, the tension of public perception, the subtle exhilaration of vulnerability, the quiet moral victories of honest self-observation. Each sensation was a small triumph, a subtle step toward integrating the person I had long hidden for myself with the world around me. And yet, questions remained. How far could this exploration go before it demanded more than private observation? How would others perceive me if these small, personal choices became visible beyond Maria's protection? How much courage was required to maintain honesty in the face of social expectation, and how much moral responsibility did I carry simply by being seen authentically? That night, lying awake in the guest room, I realized that my journey was no longer about clothing or surface identity. It was about the quiet cultivation of attention, integrity, and empathy. Each step, each glance, each decision to inhabit space differently was a moral exercise, a meditation on responsibility to oneself and to others. Visibility was no longer an abstract concept. It was an active engagement, a form of ethical and emotional labor. As I drifted into sleep, I understood something profound. The world was indifferent, yes, but within that indifference lay freedom. The freedom to observe, to choose, to act honestly, to inhabit myself fully, without pretense. And for the first time, I felt the fragile, exhilarating possibility that identity could be both stable and fluid, grounded yet evolving, observed yet sovereign. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Maria's house in a way that made everything ordinary feel profound. I woke slowly, the weight of the previous days settling into me, not as fatigue alone, but as a kind of gravity that marked growth. Each day I had walked, observed, and reflected had left a subtle trace, in posture, in awareness, in the slow recalibration of my inner world. I dressed carefully, choosing a long skirt in muted gray and a cardigan that had become familiar, almost like a second skin. As I pulled it on, I noticed again how the fabric reframed my body, how my gestures felt different, more deliberate, and how my perception of myself had begun to expand beyond the rigid outlines I had lived in for decades. Breakfast was quiet. Maria moved around the kitchen with her usual ease, the scent of brewed coffee blending with the faint tang of sea air drifting through the open window. She didn't comment on my appearance. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried a lesson I had been absorbing without realizing it. Authenticity is not a performance, and observation need not be judgmental. I drank my tea slowly, noticing its warmth, its subtle bitterness, and the way it grounded me in the present. For the first time, I felt fully aware that I could exist in the world without pretending to be someone else. Maria suggested we take a long walk along the cliffs overlooking the ocean. I hesitated, not out of fear of the physical journey, but because the thought of moving publicly in this version of myself still carried the residue of anxiety. The previous days had given me confidence, yes, but confidence was always fragile, especially when built on the unfamiliar terrain of self-exposure. Maria, as always, didn't push. She simply smiled and waited. That waiting, that quiet acceptance of my autonomy, had been instructive throughout my stay. I understood now that courage isn't forced. It's allowed, nurtured, and chosen repeatedly. The walk began slowly, deliberately. The wind off the cliffs tugged at my hair and skirt, and I noticed how the sensation of fabric against skin, the sway of my step, and the rhythm of my breath combined into a heightened awareness of presence. Each step felt like a negotiation between who I had been and who I was becoming. And with each step, the social anxiety that had shadowed my movements over the previous days began to transform. It didn't disappear. It evolved into a quiet attentiveness, a kind of vigilance that was no longer fear-driven but reflective. I was learning to inhabit my own experience fully, without judgment, without performance, without collapse. We passed families walking dogs, couples arguing softly, teenagers laughing as they ran past, and neighbors tending to gardens or chatting idly on porches. I noticed their presence, their gestures, their micro-expressions, not as a threat but as a lesson. The world, I realized, is indifferent yet intricate, vast yet intimate, and the way we navigate it reflects both our internal compass and our attention to others. I felt an almost dizzying expansion of empathy, the recognition that everyone carried unseen narratives, fears, hopes, and vulnerabilities. And in that realization, I understood something fundamental. My courage, my visibility, was not just an exploration of identity, it was a participation in the moral fabric of the world. At a bend in the cliffside path, we stopped to watch the waves crash against jagged rocks far below. Maria leaned slightly against me, a gesture of quiet camaraderie and trust. I felt an unexpected surge of gratitude, not just for her support, but for the example she had set, how to inhabit life fully, authentically, responsibly. I realized that her guidance had never been prescriptive, it had been relational. She had offered me a mirror, not a map. The reflection she provided showed me the contours of my own honesty, courage, and capacity for empathy. By midday, we arrived in a small village square. A festival had begun. Locals selling crafts, music drifting from a distant stage, children running in arcs of freedom. The chaos of it might have unsettled me once, but now I approached it with quiet attentiveness. I observed patterns, how the vendors interacted with each other, the way the music shaped the energy of the crowd, the subtle negotiations of space, attention, and presence. I moved through the scene with heightened awareness, noticing every glance, every smile, every fleeting interaction without catastrophizing. My borrowed clothes felt natural now, not costume, not disguise, but a tool for awareness, a vehicle for inhabiting space differently. A little girl approached, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. She handed it to me with a shy smile. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition of the depth of human vulnerability and trust. I accepted it, offered a small nod, and felt a subtle shift. The world could offer connection without expectation, without judgment, and I could respond with presence rather than fear. I looked to Maria, whose quiet smile encouraged me to simply exist in that moment, fully, without performance. As the afternoon progressed, a neighbor recognized me, briefly paused, smiled politely, then continued on. My chest tightened initially, the reflexive fear arising, but I reminded myself, visibility is not inherently dangerous. It is the narrative we impose upon it that carries weight. And as I walked, observed, and interacted with the world, I felt the cumulative effect of the day's quiet work. Courage was no longer mere exposure. It was attentiveness, it was presence, it was ethical engagement with the world as it exists, not as I feared it might. Returning home in the evening, the wind softer now, carrying salt and warmth, I felt a profound fatigue, not physical, but moral and emotional. I had confronted fear, internalized judgment, and vulnerability in ways that stretched me beyond comfort. Yet alongside the exhaustion was exhilaration, the subtle thrill of self-recognition, of moral and emotional growth. I realized that identity is not fixed, nor entirely performative. It is relational, fluid, and deeply contingent upon attention, reflection, and courage. That night, lying in bed, I cataloged the lessons I had learned. The borrowed clothes had been catalysts, yes, but the true transformation had been internal. The recognition of fear as separate from self, the understanding that visibility is ethical as well as psychological, the cultivation of empathy for others' unseen struggles, the capacity to inhabit a space authentically while negotiating social nuance. I felt gratitude for Maria, for her patience, for the quiet moral compass she had provided through presence rather than instruction. Sleep finally came, deep and restorative, and in that quiet surrender I understood. The person I had been performing was not gone, but it had been expanded. The person I was becoming, attentive, reflective, courageous, was now inseparable from the first. The lessons of observation, moral reflection, empathy, and authenticity were sewn into my consciousness in ways that would guide every future choice. The next morning, as I prepared to leave Maria's house and return to the routines of work, family, and social expectation, I stood at the threshold and looked back at the room, the folded clothes, the ocean visible through the window. I realized that the transformation was not in what I had worn, but in what I had allowed myself to see and feel, the courage to exist authentically, the patience to observe without fear, the moral responsibility to myself and others, and the quiet power of empathy. The lost luggage that had seemed catastrophic days before had been the unlikely catalyst for this journey. It had stripped away the scaffolding I relied on and forced me into honesty, into reflection, into presence. And I understood now, profoundly, that transformation, true, lasting, ethical transformation, does not occur in spectacle, but in attentive, responsible engagement with oneself and the world. I walked to the car with Maria at my side, the breeze tugging gently at the skirt, carrying salt and promise. I was still James. I was still Jim. But I was also something more, a man who had glimpsed the depth of identity, vulnerability, and empathy, a person who had learned to inhabit space honestly, to observe and be observed without fear, and a human being whose moral, emotional, and psychological self had grown quietly, irreversibly, in the span of a week. As I drove away from the coastal town, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house receded, the waves shimmered, the gulls wheeled overhead. And I knew, in the deep, unshakable way of truths that do not need announcement, that I would carry this experience forward, not as performance, not as spectacle, but as presence, integrity, and understanding. I had lost luggage, yes, and found a skirt. But more importantly, I had found myself. And in that quiet recognition, I understood that transformation is not about the eyes that see you, it is about the eyes that finally open within you.